and welcome everyone to another webinar series from Amsterdam Data Science. This week we've partnered with the Center of Expertise Applied Artificial Intelligence and the Open University to explore learning analytics in higher education. To quickly introduce myself, I'm Anita and I work with the ADS team. And ADS is a network organization that seeks to promote and foster the data science and AI ecosystem here in Amsterdam. We do this by connecting industry, academia, and society. And some of the activities that we're involved in, such as webinars such as these, we do these to provide people with more knowledge and insights in the field of AI and data science. Without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker of the day, and that is Bert Bredeweg. So to quickly introduce him, Dr. Bert Bredeweg is a professor of science education within the Faculty of Education at the Amsterdam University of Applied Science. He's also an associate professor within the Informatics Institute of the Faculty of Science at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on artificial intelligence and addresses several themes, including interactive knowledge representations, computational thinking, and learning analytics at the Amsterdam University of Applied Science. During his talk, Bert will introduce the Smart Education Lab and discuss ongoing research projects. He will focus on learning analytics and discuss the PhD research of Damien Fleur from the UvA and the educational data projects from the Amsterdam University of Applied Science. The first project focuses on metacognition and the question of how educational data can be used to increase student motivation. And the second project focuses on evidence-based course design and how educational data can contribute to support teachers in organizing their education in such a way that students are more likely to succeed. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Bert and I'll ask him to share his screen so he can start his presentation. Thank you, Bert.
Indeed, my name is Bert Bredeweg and I'm with the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences and with the University of Amsterdam. And maybe it's good to make this emphasis for a second that with the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, they have installed a center of expertise referred to as Applied AI, where all the faculties at the university work with AI in their, let's say, specific professional context. So that's very nice and stimulating to be part of that. And I am within this ball game, Smart Education Lab. That's we joined this Center of Expertise. And I'm then within the educational department. And within the Smart Education Lab, we do a bunch of things. We've been doing this now for 2 years since I joined this club. And if you want to read more about that, here's a little booklet of the projects and initiatives that we've been working on last year. So the Smart Education. Interactive knowledge representations, game-based learning, computational thinking, and particularly learning analytics. And that will be the main focus of my talk today. When I wrote the abstract for this presentation, I was a bit overestimating the time that I would have. So I think I should need to reduce it a bit. And I think I'll focus most on this third topic, motivation and achievement, which aligns with the PhD work of Damien, who is a PhD at the UvA. But to start with, I thought it would be nice to have a few general remarks on what we mean by learning analytics and why it's worthwhile. So let's start with that. So sometimes people think that it's just more of what we were doing already, like it's just faster because it's digital, but not fundamentally different. But then if you look carefully at it, there are a few things in there which are new, or at least provide much more focus on something than before. And one thing is that it's really about new data, not always, but also about new data that we didn't see before, didn't notice, were not aware of before. So I'll say more on that in the next slide. And that we can move now towards evidence-informed or evidence-based education and teaching, because we get much more insight in what is really happening. To emphasize this point of new data, new information, I like to point to this guy, Griet titulaar, typical Dutch, So if you're from, let's say, not born in the Netherlands, you will probably not know this guy. Or if you're really young, you don't know him either, because he is from the, what was it, 70s maybe. But at that point, and that's why I'm putting him here, he was showing new things in technology. And there was this thing called, I don't know what the English word, but video disc. And on that you could put pictures and you could put videos, and then you could put them on a player. And now we have later we have the CD player for that. But at that point, it was really complicated to make an interactive learning tool, but you could do it, and then you could use those videos on that disk to be shown on your screen. And you could do competence-based kind of skill training, like, well, it doesn't matter much. But the point is that at that point, when those things were made, nobody was thinking about or talking about how much the learner would look from a video. Would he or she only scroll through it or view it 5 times or only the first minute? So the whole viewing notion was not in our mindset. And this is exemplary for the new kind of data that by doing learning analytics we get. That's one thing. And the other thing that is new is that it's not so much reflective, like we typically do in education. We ask students, learners, what did you think? Was it a good course? And they fill out a questionnaire. But we really observe. And so we don't ask the weather, how hot are you, but we use a temperature couch, and here we really measure. So we observe what's happening. We can observe tool use, like the learning management system, if particular applications are used, EdTech, we can measure how that is being done, what errors are being made, how quickly things go. If it's collaborative, we can see how people communicate. We can know about learning dispositions, how people like to learn or how they are typically doing that, demographic data, etc. So it's a partly different kinds of data and a different way of getting that data. So I think that's important to be aware of that. My personal interest, or things that we've been working on at least, also with the University of Amsterdam, is to really work towards a loop, if you like, where we bring back that data to the user, to the stakeholder immediately. So here's a little example showing that, or a picture. Like here is the stakeholder, the learner or the teacher or the organization, and they use digital tools like at the Applied University is Brightspace, Canvas with the other university, and all kinds of tooling that people use, like feedback fruits, Graspel, whatever. They generate data, learners generate data while using those tools. They are being fetched and put in a database, typically referred to as the learning record store. And then you can do analysis on that, maybe first just describing, seeing what's going on in there. And then at some point, maybe you can do machine learning and make predictive models. And those results are being given back to the stakeholder via what we typically call a dashboard. And then the stakeholder can adjust its behavior depending on that. And I find it interesting if we can do that really real time. We can do it for the institute as a whole. We can do it for the teacher. We can do it for the student. And depending on that perspective, different things become more or less important. So today I'm focusing more on the learner. But before I go there, let me make a small remark of a large portion of the research that we can see out there that typically addresses retention using predictive models. And then you get pictures such as these. This is from Blackboard, if I'm not mistaken, where in a course you can see who is at risk and who is going very well. And then you as a teacher can maybe take actions giving this information. So working on retention is a big thing out there, finding the outliers, see how things are going. But what I find maybe more interesting, or at least equally interesting, is that if this happens and somebody is not going well, what do you do to address the situation? And that's what we've been working on for quite some time now, to see if we could somehow stimulate having this loop of showing the data and what's happening, if we can stimulate motivation, because with more motivated students, maybe they achieve more. And that's particularly also part of the work that Damien is doing, Damien Fleur here. So let me focus on that for, well, most of the remaining time, on a particular thing that we did in this context. The original work was done a few years earlier when we had this with the UVA, with Natasha Brouwer. Then we called it mirroring, but now it became a bit more specific and focus also embedded in cognitive theory. Namely, there is lots of literature on motivation, of course, but a few things are particular that we take on board here. And that is the idea that motivated people achieve more in academic settings. Okay, important. Then the question is, of course, how can we motivate people? How can we motivate students? And then there's different options. There's a notion of social comparison, that you as a person, who do you look at? Who do you compare with? So we can take that on board, think about that and what we want to show. And there's another dimension, which is goal orientation. If people set goals explicitly, they are typically more motivated and more able to achieve them. So that brings them to this research question that can we do something using goal orientation and social comparison in order to motivate learners, students, in order to have them achieve more in their academic work. So this is the setup that we worked on. And then we had a particular course. Actually, we did this for 3 courses, but I'm going to refer to one in particular, which lasted for 8 weeks. There were weekly assignments, which were scored. There was a midterm test, was the mouse here, midterm. There was an end-term test. All kinds of material, happening activities, and most of them were scored, and results of that were put in the learning management system, in this case in Canvas. Given that situation, we operationalized those 2 ideas of social comparison and goal orientation in this way, that before each assignment, the student had to say what they were planning to achieve, like I'm going to go for a 7th grade or for a 10 or for a 9 or whatever. So you put your goal before the assignment, and then you do the work, you get your grade, and then every day I think we updated this machinery, and this was what the treatment group could see. They could see themselves, which is this yellow thing here, and then they saw the information of their peers with the same goal. Let's say they go for a grade 7, but a little bit skewed to the positive side. So they saw a few students more that achieve slightly better than they were doing. So you could say this is in line with what we call upward comparison, which seems to be the most motivating driver in terms of social comparison. So this is what they were seeing, and we also showed them a prediction of the final grade. And this one was based on results from the previous courses. So given the current results, we could predict what they probably would get. And as the course proceeds in the 8 weeks, this bell curve, of course, becomes smaller and smaller, because we really get to the specific grade that a student gets. And this was all automated, right? So learners used Canvas, they did their assignments, teachers evaluated it, put their grades in Canvas, and everybody could look at the tool real time. Time is really short, I noticed, so let me go a bit quicker. And then we have these results. The red line is the treatment group, and what turned out that for the intrinsic motivation, we use the MSLQ scale for that, the students increase, get more motivated, significantly more than the control group. Sorry, on extrinsic motivation. Did I say intrinsic? I meant extrinsic motivation. And on the intrinsic motivation, they more or less stay the same, but both decrease. A few remarks on that more later. By the way, if you want to read about the details, there's this paper published last year where everything is detailed. And the other results that we have is, well, some specific assignments, particularly the homework, the treatment group was doing better. And the end result, which was our main focus, and turned out that in the end result, the final grade for the course, the treatment group scored significantly better than the control group, particularly by having less people getting an insufficient grade. So the sort of, you could say that the people on the negative side, if you like, were able to catch up, which in fact, I think is in principle a good insight. So concluding from that, it seems that having this setup, that we were able to stimulate motivation, extrinsic motivation, by people who had access to the tool, and that also their performance increased, those who had access to the tool. We were not sure, we couldn't really prove that higher motivation actually correlated significantly with higher performance. So that's something we still have to investigate. And then there were a few things that were peculiar, particularly this intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. One thing that may happen here is that this is a first-year course, really on the very first semester, that typically learners have high expectations if they start. And it's almost impossible, let's say, or in general, you see that people get a bit, well, that motivation goes down a little bit in the beginning of academic career, because things were not exactly as they expected. And this is something that we found in other course, a second-year course, where we also did the same experiment. I don't have the graphics on that here. But there we saw that the extrinsic motivation shows the same pattern as here, increasing significantly for the treatment. But for both groups, the intrinsic motivation stays the same, which goes inside with the idea that if you're in the second year, you know what the academic life is like, you know how courses are being given, and motivation, the intrinsic motivation, is more or less at a certain level. That's what we found out in this other course. And now we still have a question that we were not really sure about, or that's still open. That is the social comparison. We took the, let's say, upwards nearby, but there's some discussion about what really is the best way to do that. For example, maybe some people like to compare, let's say, on the negative side, like we don't want to be like those people, or they want to look at extreme cases. So in a follow-up study, what we would like to do is to give the students the freedom to choose who they want to compare with, to see if that freedom has an impact on motivation. Anita, if there's questions, please let me know. Otherwise, let me take a few more minutes to introduce the second topic. So this was the work of Damien, a snapshot of it, because his whole work is about metacognition, so there's much more happening than just this one. But I thought this one is interesting for this community. How can you use the data, the learning analytics, and present it in such a way to learners that it increases their motivation, their academic achievement, if you like. Another line of research that is, let's say, emerging, and particularly more at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences at this moment, is to go towards evidence-informed or evidence-based course design. And I'm really happy that Bart is joining us today, because I think that's his expertise, so we would really like to hear from him how to do that, what he knows about that. But let me just put to you the idea, the question that we face, if you like. This is something that happened to me, recently, but before we went into the COVID experience. I was giving a lecture 8 weeks again, a big group of students, about 200, And in the lecture room, there was all this equipment to store, to record the lectures and make them available via webinars. And students were saying, well, we would really like to have that. Why don't you record and make it available for us? We can do a better job, we learn better, it's much more, it's better for us. And we as old-fashioned teachers were not so sure that was a good idea, but anyway, we went with them, so we did it, and we thought, okay, let's see what happens with those webinars. Will class attendance drop? Will they perform better, etc.? And I'm not going over to the details, but I thought it was insightful to see what really happened. And this is a view of viewing per webinar, which is quite normal. Like you see in the beginning, they start viewing, then it's not really starting. At some point, 5-10 minutes into the lecture starts, so then everybody's on board. People view it, they stop in the break, and they come again after 10 minutes, and then you watch to the end. So the viewing behavior is fine. But then if you look at the total viewing behavior over the whole course, and on the one hand side, we saw this coming, but I was still flabbergasted by the extreme of it, that these are the exams, that really just before the first midterm exam, there was a huge burst in viewing. And for the final exam, even worse, a huge burst in viewing. And for the resit, there was almost no viewing. So instead of what you would like to have, that during the course, people look at the videos, do their stuff, and skill themselves, they tend to postpone it to the last moment and then do it all on the last day. And in a way, we know that things work like that, but still surprising to see it so evidently by the data. And then the big question is, that I get quite a bit from people nowadays, is that, okay, I design my course in a certain way, and fine, but I'm not really sure if what I'm doing is effective for learning. Do the students do what I think they should do, or do they very different things? And what can I do in my course to make it more effective? And of course, we can have many more exams and little tests, and that may help, of course, but maybe that's not the most inspiring way of making a course. And there's these, well, very different views like e-tivities that propose all kinds of other ways of working formats. So the question out there is really, okay, how can I design my course and how can I measure the effectiveness of it with respect to learners so that they can get the best out of the course, and that we get evidence for that. So let me conclude here. I briefly discussed what learning analytics is and how it's an added value. I made a point that a lot of work is on retention. We've been working on this idea of motivation and increasing achievement, and we do this particularly now with Damien, with his PhD work. And we have a great interest to move towards this evidence course design, and particularly this is being sort of set up, if you like, at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And I think I should stop here, just showing my last slide, which I've made into a habit nowadays, which is that we are into creating smart people with intelligence and not intelligence per se. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Bert, for that really informative presentation. Quite a couple of questions have come in, actually. The general being, first of all, whether the slides will be shared. They would be shared, just to let everybody know that. Okay, but to give you some of these questions. So Andrew would like to ask, first he would like to say, thanks for your talk. There's a lot of focus on grades, goals for grades, and extrinsic motivation. Is there any research starting/done on getting a learning analytics loop for intrinsic motivation?
So specifically, I don't know, I must admit. We were expecting, we're hoping, let's say, that intrinsic motivation would be increased. Didn't happen, and we understand why. So I think, yes, there's much more on that than what we showed here today. But what I think would be a fair criticism on our work is that we focus maybe too much on the grading, and that there is so much more in education, like who is talking to whom, are you well connected, how do you collaborate? And there's many more factors that should be taken into account to let's say, establish how well somebody is learning, how well somebody is doing as, let's say, academic achievement. And I was listening yesterday evening to a solar lecture, which I think is online. You can view it if you want, which did exactly that. We said, okay, let's forget about the grades for a second and see what kind of other factors there are to think about how well somebody is doing in terms of learning. And that person made the remark that it's not so much about grading and increasing on a grade, but that people go to qualitatively different periods, if you like. And that if you switch to a next level of abilities, that you become, let's say, a new, better learner. And I thought that was really interesting. And that, I think, something that we might also take into account.
All right. Thank you. So we've got 2 more minutes left. So I just want to ask these 2 questions, that in quite briefly. So Robert would like to know, is the reset situation because fewer people had to do a resit, or how would you explain the breaking of the pattern?
Exactly that, yes. On average, in the treatment group, fewer people don't succeed in the, let me rephrase that positively, more people succeed in the first try immediately. Yeah, correct.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Bert, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'll now like to move on to our second speaker. So I will introduce him. So our second speaker is Dr. Bart Rienties. He's a professor of learning analytics and program lead of the Learning Analytics and Learning Design Research Program at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University, UK. He leads a group of academics who provide university-wide learning analytics and learning design solutions and conducts evidence-based research on how students and professionals learn. So the Open University UK has been implementing learning analytics and learning design on a large scale since 2012. The Open University has been at the forefront of testing, implementing, and evaluating the impacts of learning analytics and learning design on student outcome and retention. However, despite the large uptake of learning analytics at the Open University, there are a range of complex issues in terms of buy-in from staff, data infrastructures, ethics and privacy, student engagement, and perhaps most importantly, how to make sense of big and small data in a complex organization like the Open University. So during his talk, Bart will be presenting on the implementation and learnings of this. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Bart, and he can start presenting and sharing the screen. Thank you very much, Bart.
So there's so much to say about the Open University, so it's actually quite difficult to pick a particular topic. But I think it's really important to what Bert was saying previously. It's really important to think about context in which you use learning analytics. And the Open University is a weird organization. It's a wonderful organization. It's open to anyone that likes to study. We're apparently the largest university in Europe, but we get a tremendously diverse group of students into our learning environment. So as a result, we need to be really careful how we position learning analytics. So what I really liked about Bert's presentation was, as far as I understood, that all this data are shared to students. At this point in time, we don't share learning analytics directly to students. We share this with our teachers. And the reason why we do this is that we have a large percentage of our students who have a so-called declared disability. And for example, if you're bipolar and you might see, hey, you're at risk, you might react very differently, or than if you have another mental or physical disability. So we basically use teachers to make a translation from whatever the predictive analytics tells you and helps them to transform perhaps some of the ideas in a kind of safe environment. So I hope this gives a little bit of context. The Open University, apparently to Web of Science, is #1 in the world in terms of publishing. And as a result, there's so much work out there that I can't really touch upon in 20 minutes. But there's a quite nice paper by Ed Wakelam that basically summarized what we do at the Open University in in 4 different streams. So on the one hand, and that's what I will show you today, we use a range of dashboards to support our academics. Then we have the so-called Analytics for Action initiative, where we work with teachers to make sense of all this analytics and help them to change their learning design based on whatever they see from the data. And this evidence-based approach is really empowering our teachers. I won't touch upon that either. Then we use learning analytics to put specific student interventions. So we might mail students who are potentially at risk, or a student that, for example, hasn't registered for an exam. And then last but not least, we've done a lot of work in terms of ethics that I, again, will not touch upon because we've published quite a lot on this. So I will mainly focus on the first bit and focus on how we've implemented this on a large scale with our teachers. So what you see on the next slide is some of the screenshots of our actual dashboards that we give to our teachers. And this is based on a combination of artificial intelligence and learning analytics approaches. And what we're basically doing is to work with the teacher to identify what, according to the teacher, are the main milestones in a particular course, the main kind of potential bottlenecks. But at the same time, we're using a range of machine learning approaches to identify how students are actually engaging through the course. So we're basically using intelligence from the teacher, but also intelligence from the student. And the next picture might look a little bit frightening. So the next picture is basically the first 5 weeks that a student will go through in a particular course, and then we can see there are multiple pathways to Rome, but we can see which kind of activities are actually helping students to be more or less successful. And based on these blueprints of actual student behavior, we then make predictions on how our students are studying. And as a result, we then present these in dashboards. And it was quite nice to hear from Bert that this social comparison, this is also a functionality in the tool that we have at the Open University. So on the bottom right of this screen, you see with number 4 indicated we have a kind of social network, and it allows students to, or teachers to, it allows teachers to see how similar or how different students are to other students, and whether or not they are going to be successful or not in terms of passing the next assignment. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the technicalities on this, but if you're interested, you can freely make an account and play around with the data. And also we've published a lot of data for people to use if they want to, and test and validate this. So what have we then learned in terms of our own implementation? So we started in 2013-14, literally with 2 teachers. And we worked very intensively with those teachers to try to understand what could be, the key activities that are available in a course. What could we do in terms of trying to understand how we could build these dashboards? The dashboards that you actually see are based on financial forecasting models and have nothing to do with education. And from 2014, we moved to 2015, where we had 10 teachers. And then in the year, that's where the data starts in this figure. You see in 2015-16, we had 58 teachers getting access to OU Analyze. And in 2015-16, 89% of those teachers, aka 52 teachers, logged in and made use of the data. Then we had a quite nice growth spurt in 2016-17, where we had 706 teachers engaged, or at least registered, in OU Analyze, and then around 33% of the teachers engaged. Then we had a slight dip in terms of engagement the year after, and if you follow the news, you can Google what happened in 2017. I won't dwell too much on that. And eventually, we're currently in 2020, and nearly all our 7,000 teachers, it's not actually on this particular slide, all our 7,000, we call them associate lecturers, have access to our OU Analyze systems. And what you see in a way in a visualization is that on the one hand, we've had a tremendous uptake in terms of the number of teachers who log in, who have access to OU Analyze. But at the same time, you can see that the number of teachers as a percentage that have actually used OU Analyze has dropped a little bit over time. And I think this is quite natural in the sense that typically when you're going through this growth phase, in the early stages, you have the early adopters, the keen enthusiasts who are keen to work with this. But there's, of course, a big challenge once you upskill, in particular on such a large scale. How do you make sure that all or most of the lectures are engaged? And at this point in time, associate lecturers, as we call them, are not expected or paid for to look at these dashboards. So it's in a way an additional task that is put on them. So you can understand that some teachers might be reluctant to look at these dashboards. If we then look a little bit closer to these dashboards, this is the a heat map of engagement between the faculties over time, and this was in 2015-16. And if we then move to 2016-17, what is quite interesting is that if you look over time in certain disciplines, like in social science, there's a quite heavy engagement that continues over time, while in others it might just be one or two teachers logging into the environment. Similarly, suddenly in 2017-18, suddenly social science didn't engage whatsoever, and I can perhaps offline talk about why that was. And most recently, this is the recent data that at least we published in this paper, you see an average that all the teachers started to use this analytics from the beginning, but the average percentage is relatively low. And again, this could be in part explained by the fact that these teachers, these associate lecturers, are not necessarily paid to look to this kind of data. If you then divide the data in a slightly different way, if you, for example, distinguish teachers from managers to so-called course chairs, in Dutch we would say blokcoördinators, there's a quite substantial difference in terms of disciplines and also in terms of the kind of roles. So what we did in this follow-up study was to dig much deeper into trying to understand why there were some of these differences, and we arranged a number of themes from our qualitative interviews. And what we found was that the way how faculties engage with OU Analyze is heavily predictive for the uptake of learning analytics. So for example, in business and law, we found really strong support by the deans and all the senior management, as well as the people on the work floor, to use learning analytics, while in other disciplines, not to name and shame, but in this case, social science, there was a less uptake. Another key factor that we found over the years was when you have teachers as champions, they basically encourage other teachers to start to adopt learning analytics over time. So what we find that it's not only important to have the senior people buying into this from a strategic point of view, but also having the champions driving change. A third factor that helped to convince teachers to buy in or not was the amount of evidence that we gathered. In certain faculties, we gained a lot of evidence, in particular from randomized control trials, where we really could highlight that OU Analyze was making a tremendous difference. So I didn't put this on the slide, but the second best predictor for whether or not OU students are passing OU courses is whether or not a teacher logs into OU Analyze. And there could be hundreds of reasons why this is, but it highlights the importance of teachers being actively engaged with these tools. Then there's this point of digital literacy. So teachers have to be quite skilled to interpret all these complex dashboards, and some teachers felt just more comfortable using these relative to others. And last but not least, and I think this is a really important issue, is thinking about conceptualizations of teaching. Some teachers thought, well, it's not my role to look at this kind of activities, while others thought it was really essential to do this. So this might explain also some of the differences that we found. So what we're currently doing is to gently start to explore student-facing analytics. As I said, with the the accessibility needs, we have to be really careful. So we've started to do a range of experiments on a small scale with a couple of modules. And here you see one of the recommendation systems. So what we've done is we've given in one particular course 22 undergraduate business students examples of dashboard and allowed them to play with their actual data. And what was really interesting is that the majority of the participants found this study recommender system, which I didn't explain extremely well, but what you see here at the bottom is these study recommendation systems are basically activities that we can see from our learning analytics could be really useful for that particular student to follow, a kind of Netflix recommendation system. And they also thought it was extremely useful to be able to directly access content that they needed. So in our virtual learning environment, you have to click through all these various activities, but if you're using the study recommender, you could immediately go to these particular activities that are deemed to be important. At the same time, there were substantial differences between participants in terms of how they felt whether or not this was useful or not. So some were skeptical towards the trustworthiness of the dashboard. And what was particularly interesting, and this goes in a way in contrast to perhaps what Bert was saying, and this could be again due to the context, they absolutely hated these peer comparisons. So they didn't want to be compared to others. This was across all 22. Another thing that was interesting is that students who were very self-confident academically were much more positive about these tools than students who were perhaps less self-confident. And this again could potentially help to inform how we're implementing these learning analytics systems, because the data thus far seems to indicate that so-called good students really like this, but the not so good students are worried about this. So we have to be really careful when we're giving dashboards. So I'm mindful of time. So further reflections, the fundamental question that we've learned over the last 10 years is the question, okay, who owns this data? What do we give to students? What do we give to teachers? What about the ethics of using all this data? Do we have a moral obligation, for example, to teachers who are not using OU Analyze to actually force them in between brackets to use it if we know that, for example, this is a very strong predictor for student success? How do we actually train our teachers in terms of making use of all these skills and these dashboards? Because we know that digital literacy is such an important component. And then last but not least, I think this is a good comment from Professor Paul Kirchner when he was critically reflecting on our work. We do a lot of work, of course, on optimizing our learning processes, but he was perhaps saying, well, maybe we're optimizing the record player, and we should perhaps think not only about optimizing our process, but also thinking about different ways of teaching. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Bart. That was a very informative presentation. I do have one question that's already come in from Robert. And what he's asking is, the LA comes from Future Learn platform. How do you collect these data? Can you give some info about the data pipeline, if possible?
Yeah, so the data that I shared with OU Analyze is not coming from FutureLearn, it's coming from our own Moodle environment. So what we do is we pipe the data from Moodle to a separate environment, and there we analyze the kind of learning activities that a student is engaged with. So for example, whether a student posted on a forum, whether it looked at a particular learning activity, whether it participated in the particular wiki. And then based on these combination of activities, we then see, okay, which of this combination of learning activities leads to students passing a particular assignment or not. And based on those pathways, we then make a recommendation. Is this pathway useful or not? So I hope that is helpful.
Thank you for that response.
If I may, I would like to ask Bart to tell us a bit more about the difference that you have observed over the years between the ideas students have on what they think about the course, how well they study, etc., etc. Let's say their reflective insights compared to when you measure with the data what they do and how they behave, and if it's in line with each other or if that's interesting differences that you observe. Maybe you can share a bit about that kind of insights that you have.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it links also very nicely to the discussion about grades and about learning dispositions and about the process of learning. And given that we have such a diverse group of learners within the Open University, it's really, I mean, complex. So one of the things which I personally don't like about, for example, OU Analyze, is that it's so much focus on predicting the next assignment. It doesn't necessarily tell us very much to what your work has been doing in terms of, okay, what are the motivations for people to join? How do we, I mean, we have students studying for 6 to 10 years part-time, and maybe the first year when you joined, you wanted to study, I don't know, economics because you wanted to improve your labor market position. But maybe over time you've decided, oh, I want to do something completely different. I want to, I don't know, set up a company that becomes an NGO for, I'm just making this up while I go along, refugees in North Milton Keynes. So your motivations to study could fundamentally change, and that's what we're currently not tapping into. And I think once we start to swap from kind of teacher analytics to student analytics, I think this becomes more and more important. And a shameless plug to the work that I'm doing with Dirk Templar at Maastricht University. There we do a lot of research on students' learning dispositions and actually giving them real-time data about their dispositions, and also trying to help them to reflect on, hey, you're, for example, extrinsically motivated and very low intrinsically motivated. Here are 4 or 5 things you could potentially think about if you want to perhaps change the way how you study. So I think this is another big gap that we have to work very hard on at the Open University.
All right, thank you very much for answering that question, Bart.
I have a whole bunch of these questions, but let me just do one more. I would also be interested, because you have so much experience, Bart, on seeing what teachers set out in a course, what activities they expect learners, students to do, and then you see what really happens. And it's sort of known that if you have more tests in the course, better chances that somebody's actually doing something at a certain moment. But then again, tests are a bit boring. They are. So what would be examples of innovative, successful activities that are not, let's say, a test per se, but other kinds of things that actually motivate students and help them to be more engaged? So what can we do beyond testing, if you like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult because we have so many great things at the Open University. It's difficult to pick one topic. So if we move slightly to a different thing, which I didn't discuss in the presentation, we do a lot of work in terms of mapping how teachers design their courses, and then what are students actually doing. And what is fascinating from that work, and I will post the paper in a minute in the chat, is that the #1 key factor for students successfully completing course at the Open University is not assessments. What we have found that the key predictor for Open University students is whether or not teachers include so-called communicative activities. So for example, what we're doing now, we're sharing thoughts, we're sharing ideas, we're talking to each other, we're chatting with each other. That seems to be a key driver for continuous engagement by our students. And obviously, I mean, when I was teaching economics myself, I was mostly focused just on content and testing whether my students understood the content of my course, but not thinking necessarily, okay, where are the opportunities for students to critically discuss key issues, for example, in economics. So if there's one thing that we have learned from big data analysis at the Open University, is think about how you can also ensure that your learners have the opportunity to critically work with teachers or students on the materials, like in discussions.
All right. Thank you very much for that answer, Bart. I have another question from Ed, and they'd like to know, is there an age dependency, e.g. part-time students already working versus full-time students? Also, is there a difference between applied university and a science university?
Oh, difficult question. To talk about age first. So I think the Open University in the Netherlands is slightly different from the Open University UK. So our average age is continuously declining, and we increasingly see more and more students that are so-called traditional age students between 18 and 25. And what we see is that these students make a conscious decision, perhaps also due to COVID, to learn online and learn full-time online. And they seem to be doing really well. Then we have the kind of typical older learner. They seem to be doing quite well, but there's this middle group, of learners between 30 to 50, and they of course have caring responsibilities, work, etc. And for them it's much more difficult to combine work with sorry, I'm trying to get rid of my cough, but I don't have any water with me. In terms of the applied versus university narrative, that is a real factor. So we have a broad range of disciplines within the Open University, and we see substantial differences in terms of how teachers engage, but also how students engage. So it's a can of worms which we probably should open once the recording stops.
All right, thank you very much for that. Okay, that was the last question for today, as we've come to the end of our webinar event today. I'd like to say a big thank you to both Bert and Bart for their insightful and informative presentation today. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone that attended as well. Please keep an eye out on our Meetup page for events that we'll be having in May. And if there are any questions for us, please let us know through that as well. And we'll be sure to share the recordings as well as the slides of both presentations with you all. So lastly, thank you again, Bert and Bart. That was really informative. And that is the end of our event today. Okay, bye everyone.